Okay, so imagine this. You're like really digging into the history of communism.
Right.
You're expecting, I don't know, fiery manifestos, calls for global revolution, all that jazz.
Right.
But then you stumble across this text
Okay.
and it kind of throws you for a loop.
Yeah.
It basically says that modern communism, well, it hasn't just strayed from its roots, but it might actually be hurting the very people it's supposed to be helping, the working class.
Interesting.
Wild. Right. And what makes it even juicier is that even the source itself is like, yeah, this text is kind of suspect. Origins are murky. The stance is pretty radical.
Wow.
But hey, that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
To unpack this whole thing, see if it holds any water. Is it actually onto something, or is it just, well, full of hot air?
I'm ready.
To help us break it all down, we've got our resident expert on, well, all things political theory and history.
Happy to be here.
So help me out here. What's the main thrust of this text's argument? What's it really trying to say?
Well, what I find fascinating is how this text just dives right into this whole idea of betrayal.
Betrayal.
Yeah, like it argues that instead of pushing for this, worldwide workers' revolution, which theoretically they should be doing, right?
Right.
These modern communist parties, they're more interested in playing the long game within the existing system, aligning with certain power blocks, East versus West, that kind of thing.
So not exactly the image of storming the barricades that usually comes to mind when we think about communism, huh?
Yeah.
It almost sounds like, well, are they saying that these parties have become establishment?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And the text gets pretty spicy. Like they even go as far as comparing this to how movements like anarchism and social democracy, which started with these grand visions of equality and, upending power structures, they ended up becoming, well, arguably less revolutionary over time.
Right.
So it's like this cautionary tale about what happens when ideologies bump up against, the messy reality of actually trying to change the world.
Okay, so we've got compromised ideals, historical parallels. This is already getting juicy. But we are talking about communism here, a movement that's supposed to be all about, sticking it to the man, right?
Okay.
So to understand how the text backs up such a bold claim, we need to dig into a specific example it uses. SolidNet and their stance on the recent conflict in the Middle East. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, SolidNet is this network of, get this, over 40 communist parties from around the globe.
Wow.
Yeah, not exactly small potatoes.
No.
And the text claims that their statement on the 2023 Middle East conflict, it speaks volumes. But not by what they say, but by what they leave out.
Oh, interesting.
So what's missing?
Well, according to the text, there's no mention of the events that actually sparked the conflict. No mention of the ongoing hostage situations or like the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. It's like these crucial details are just missing.
So if they're not talking about any of that, what does the statement actually focus on?
It's more about condemning the actions of one side, and I think aligning with a particular narrative, which, if you're following the text logic, feeds into this whole idea of these communist parties, basically picking a side in this bigger geopolitical power struggle instead of, actually looking out for the working class that are caught in the middle of it all.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder where that whole workers of the world unite thing went off the rails, right? Like, what happened?
Exactly. And the text takes it a step further by claiming that SolidNet's position on the conflict pretty much mirrors that of the International Meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties, or IMCWP for short.
Ah, yes, the IMCWP. Another group that I'm sure most people have never even heard of.
Right.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. And this is where the text really starts digging into the concept of imperialism.
Okay, so walk me through this. How does imperialism fit into all of this, and what's the text's take on it?
It's like even if they might disagree on other stuff happening in the world, they both seem to have this blind spot when it comes to calling out imperialism consistently.
Right.
Like they're willing to point the finger at one bloc, but then kind of brush over the actions of another.
So it's like a double standard then, choosing which imperialism to get riled up about. But doesn't that go against the whole idea of global solidarity?
Yeah.
If you're truly fighting for the working class, shouldn't you be calling out any form of exploitation or oppression, regardless of who's doing it?
That's exactly the point the text is trying to make. It's saying, look, we can't just play this game of picking sides in a system that's inherently flawed.
Right.
And this is where it gets really interesting. See, the text goes beyond just saying that these groups are being inconsistent.
Okay.
It digs into how they frame the whole concept of imperialism itself.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for us. How does the text redefine imperialism?
So typically when we think about imperialism, we think about like the actions of a specific country or state, right?
Right.
Like one nation exerting its power over others.
Yeah.
But this text,
Yeah.
it takes cues from Lenin.
Okay.
And it argues that imperialism isn't just something a country does. It's like baked into the entire capitalist system. It's less about which nation is on top and more about how the whole system itself is designed to benefit a select few at the expense of, the many.
So it's less about like specific bad actors and more about the entire stage being rigged from the get-go. It's giving, you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it kind of vibes.
Exactly. And the text uses that reframing to challenge this whole idea of picking sides in these global conflicts. Like, if imperialism is, as the text argues, this inherent feature of capitalism as a whole, then throwing your support behind one block over another is basically just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Meaning it's not actually going to lead to any real lasting change for the working class.
Yeah.
If anything, it just distracts from the real work of dismantling the entire system.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah.
That's got to sting for anyone trying to make change within those existing power structures.
It definitely challenges a lot of assumptions. But to be fair, the text doesn't just, throw out these critiques without acknowledging that there are other viewpoints out there.
Oh, there are always other viewpoints.
Yeah.
What are some of the counter-arguments that the text brings up? And I this must ruffle some feathers.
For sure. One of the arguments the text highlights is this idea that, look, sometimes you have to pick a side, even if it's not ideal.
Right.
It mentions this communist activist named Evgeny Ivanikov,
Okay.
who argues that supporting any force, even if they're not perfect, that weakens Western imperialism is like a strategic necessity.
So it's a kind of the enemy of my enemy situation.
Right.
Like you might not love everything about this other group, but at least they're pushing back against the bigger threat.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a pragmatic viewpoint for sure. Choose your fire based on who's the bigger obstacle to achieving global socialism, even if it makes you uncomfortable.
Right. And Ivanikov is pretty clear in his assessment. The text summarizes his take on the actions of, the U.S., the EU, China, Russia, basically laying out this whole picture of a multipolar world where alliances are constantly in flux.
So how does the text respond to this whole pick your battles approach?
Well, it argues that focusing solely on these kind of interblock squabbles, on choosing the lesser evil in each situation, it ultimately distracts from that larger goal, dismantling the entire capitalist system, which it sees as, inherently imperialistic, regardless of who's calling the shots at any given moment.
So it's not about achieving little victories within the existing power structure. It's about fundamentally changing the game itself.
Exactly. And this is where the text gets really, really provocative. Like, it's not just critiquing the actions of these communist parties, it's questioning their entire approach.
Okay.
Even going as far as to say that modern communism has basically become counter-revolutionary.
Whoa, hold on. Counter-revolutionary, that's a heavy accusation. How do they even support that claim?
Well, remember we were talking about Lenin's 4 stages of achieving socialism earlier?
Yeah, wasn't the third stage something about a communist party, like, coming into power?
Exactly. But the 4th stage, that's where things were supposed to get, really interesting, according to Lenin. This is the stage where you move beyond just having a, state-controlled economy.
Right.
This is about achieving a society where production is truly managed by the people for the people, a genuinely classless society.
Okay, so a utopia of sorts.
Right.
But what does that have to do with the text's argument?
Well, the text argues that the USSR's downfall was that it never actually made it to that 4th stage. It got stuck.
Okay.
And because of that failure, it created this void.
Okay.
And that void is what allowed communist parties to become, tools of the very system they were supposed to be challenging.
Wait, so instead of pushing for that final stage, that radical transformation, these parties are actually propping up the systems that, go against their core principles.
That's the text's argument.
Oh.
Yeah, it claims that instead of being a force for revolution, these parties have become a force for maintaining the status quo, serving various capitalist interests instead of actually challenging the system itself.
Wow. Okay, that is a bold claim. So what are we supposed to do with this information? What's the alternative, according to the text?
The text argues that true revolution, true change, requires a completely different approach, one that learns from the mistakes of the USSR and recognizes that aligning with any existing power structure, even if it seems like the strategic thing to do in the moment, will ultimately undermine the potential for real, lasting change.
So it's not about picking sides, it's about creating a whole new game board.
Yeah.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It definitely is. And it leads to some really big questions. Like, if these established ideologies and institutions have failed, both in theory and in practice, then how can the proletariat actually achieve true emancipation? Is there even a path forward outside of these existing frameworks, or are we just, are we doomed to just keep repeating the mistakes of the past?
Those are some heavy questions.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's giving you a bit of an existential crisis. Like,
Yeah.
what do we do with all of this? Where do we go from here?
Right.
This is definitely a lot to unpack. This text throws a real wrench into how we think about social progress, especially given, the baggage of history and this crazy world that we're living in.
Right. It's almost as if the text is, like, challenging us directly.
Yeah. Yeah.
If these established ideologies and movements have kind of missed the mark, or even worse, betrayed their original purpose, what do we do now?
So bringing it all back to the heart of the matter, this text really isn't pulling any punches. Like, it's presenting this really stark view of modern communism, claiming it's become, entangled with the very forces it was meant to dismantle.
Yeah.
It's like showing up at a protest and realizing you're, like, standing next to the people that you thought you were protesting against.
Right.
It's kind of wild.
Yeah.
And it drives that point home by using these concrete examples, right?
Yeah.
The rise and fall of the USSR, the actions of these current communist parties, it's arguing that aligning with any existing power structure, even with the best of intentions, ultimately, sabotages the possibility of real systemic change.
It's true.
It's definitely a perspective that's going to make some people uncomfortable.
For sure.
But maybe that's the point, to, like, shake us out of our comfort zones and make us question, what we think we know, and force us to take a hard look at how we approach these systems of power and inequality that feel so deeply entrenched.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's easy to get stuck in old ways of thinking, even when it comes to, revolution.
Of course. It's very easy. And that's what I find so thought-provoking about this text. It raises these, like, fundamental questions that I think go beyond any one ideology.
Right.
How do we create a more equitable future when, like, the roadmaps we've been using seem to be leading us in circles?
Yeah.
Is there a way to, like, break free from these existing frameworks, or are we destined to keep making the same mistakes generation after generation?
Yeah, those are the questions that I'm left grappling with. I mean, this deep dive feels less like closing a chapter and more like opening a door to, like, a whole new library of questions.
Yeah.
Which I guess is a good thing, right? It means
Yeah.
we're actually, like, thinking critically, engaging with these complex ideas.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can't just accept things at face value. We have to constantly question our assumptions and, be willing to challenge the status quo, even if it makes us uncomfortable, especially in, like, a world that's overflowing with information, competing narratives.
Oh, absolutely. So where does this leave us? If we accept, the text's premise that these movements and ideologies have faltered, how do we even begin to fight for the rights of the working class? Not just in theory, but in a way that creates, tangible change.
That is the million-dollar question. And while this text doesn't necessarily offer any, like, easy answers, and really what good source material does,
Right.
at least it gives us a framework, a new lens for viewing these issues. Perhaps the answer lies not in clinging to these, outdated ideologies, but in finding new ways to empower individuals and communities, demanding accountability from, those in power, and constantly questioning the systems that perpetuate inequality.
It's a call to action, for sure.
Yes.
A reminder that the pursuit of a just and equitable world requires us to, stay vigilant, think critically, and, like you said, be willing to challenge even our most, deeply held beliefs. Because maybe, just maybe, real change comes from, looking beyond the old maps and forging a new path forward.
I like that.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those questions. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.